Well, let's talk about some of your legislative work, because that is, as you say, in several areas. President Bush's tax cuts, which you championed through, the Medicare prescription drug bill, all the trade liberalization and globalization initiatives of both presidents, certainly. And looking at one that came up recently in your tenure, which I know is near and dear to your heart, you have been trying and trying to get the government, Congress and the executive branch, to tackle the impending crisis of Social Security. Mm-hmm. Why did that not happen in your last year in office, do you think? Why was it just not possible once again, and why is it seems like it's never possible to do something as far-reaching as reform and entitlement as important as Social Security?
Well, but that's with the backdrop of actually having accomplished entitlement reform in Medicare. And of course, once we got the concepts in place, it was a real fight. We had to compromise to get them in place, which is entirely appropriate on a fundamental entitlement program. Those Democrats who cooperated with us, of course, were vilified. But look what's happening in the marketplace. The prices are going down. We're beginning to see that there is a synergy there that can work. I'm not saying the market is a perfect place for health care. It isn't. But that doesn't mean there isn't some room for a market concept. The problem that you have to realize is that Medicare was very important to the Democrats. Social Security is the sine qua non. It is the raison d'etre. It is the save Social Security, vote Democrat. That's a bumper sticker. And that was at the absolute core of their being. That defined them as a party. If we were going to be able to make changes there, that probably would have locked us in as the majority party forever. So it was a power struggle. Now, I find interesting, we just finished a pension bill, a major fundamental change in the pension area. One of the provisions that we put in on the Ways and Means Committee was, since we're moving from a defined benefit to a defined contribution world, those people who joined a company that had a company-defined benefit got the retirement package. Those people who joined a defined contribution company had to voluntarily sign up to have that money withheld, with matching funds more often than not from the employer. The sign-up rate wasn't that high. So we decided, in consultation with a lot of folk, to create a mandatory, it's kind of like automobile options, a mandatory option that you got signed up for your 401k almost always, contribution, and the only way you wouldn't have it taken out of your paycheck is you say, I don't want it. This will be a significant advance. But now what is it that we set up on a bipartisan basis? A personal account that they have control of, which assists them in an entitlement area developed for retirement. That isn't all that much different than we were talking about in Social Security. But it was vehemently opposed in that context because it would have been restructuring Social Security. So it was the context in which it was done. It was in part the way in which it was presented. And it was following on our ability to win a number of victories within the tax code, empowering individuals, believing that if you incentivize people to invest and get a return, you can actually make more tax revenue available. The fight over capital gains and dividends, which has produced significant revenue, which is reducing our deficit, and that if we were going to be successful in those areas and we applied those same concepts modified to Social Security and we were successful in that area as well, there would be nothing left for the Democrats as a core, as a raison d'etre for their party. So it was absolute catechism. You could not work in any way with Democrats, and any idea other than the current system was anathema and was to be opposed violently. People thought that was going to be the same way with the Medicare prescription drugs. It isn't even on the radar screen for candidates running against each other now.
And that was incredibly controversial at the time that it passed from both parties, much more from the Democrats. They clearly opposed it. Some of the more conservative Republicans also opposed it.
Well, we were increasing entitlements by $400 billion, and that was the reason they opposed it.
Right.
But we tried to explain to them it was going to be here anyway, so why not do it in the most meaningful way to produce product that changes? You do not want formularies in statute. You've got to have them as the market changes and products change, changeable.
What happened that night when the vote was held open for almost 3 hours, which much has been made of because it took such a long time to have something happen on the floor to get the bill passed? What happened that night?
Well, what happened was that we were convinced we could find enough people to vote for it, and we did. The idea somehow that in making a decision in a parliamentary body, a time limit which is a minimum, that is you have 15 minutes to get to the floor to vote, therefore becomes the maximum. And if you don't stop the voting in 15 minutes, you have violated some rule. That's nonsense. In the 16 years that I was in the minority, I watched the roll being held open over and over and over again. Of course, it wasn't that difficult when you had 50-plus majority and you could excuse 30 of them. And you did it on a rotating basis, so you always had a majority available to you. But when you have a margin of 16 or 18, and there was enormous pressure on the Democrats not to support the bill, I would suggest somebody interview David Wu and ask him how the pressure from Oregon, how the pressure was on him to hang the vote out for 3 hours, because he told me he was with us. And he had to endure the pressure on the Democratic side for 3 hours. So if something as fundamentally important as a major change in an entitlement program that had been opposed for political reasons, and we had come to a bipartisan agreement in a conference on Medicare modernization to add drugs, long overdue drugs to Medicare, and that you were on the floor of the House and you were within 2 or 3 votes, I think most people, if you put it in that context, would say it would be unconscionable to wrap the gavel after 15 minutes and say, well, you tried, too bad, come back in 20 years and try again. The 3 hours pales to the 30 years that the Democrats had to put drugs into Medicare. When we came in 95, there was no osteoporosis, there was no prostate, there was no diabetes, there was no, I'll go on and on in terms of preventive care. Wellness and prevention were not a part of Medicare. Drugs should have been a long time ago. We were able to come that close within a couple of hours to get the votes to make it happen. If you put it in that context, if it had taken double the time we should have taken it to get that policy in place. And of course now, several years later, it's not a big deal.
I'm going to ask the students in just a couple of seconds, but I want to be sure to ask you this, because you're correct that Congress had never before been able to do this. When you look back on everything that you have accomplished legislatively, and I often see that, and it would be difficult, I think, for our students to completely follow the export subsidy legislation, but I know that that's near and dear to your heart. But what would you say, of all the things that you have done, looking back, is the one that hits you in the heart the most in terms of what you were able to accomplish?
Well, I prefer hitting in my head rather than my heart.
Let's go for the heart.
But there's not, no, it's hard to put it in context. And of course, it's like every kid. You love them all, but each one is different. And so you have to look at maybe doing something that hasn't been done and also perhaps has been underappreciated in terms of when it was done and how it was done. I might say parenthetically that when anyone talks to you about the American political process and complains that process should be paramount, but then in the next sentence says accommodation and compromise is necessary. Why isn't there accommodation and compromise on process as well as substance? And they hang their hat on a 3-hour vote when it should have only been 15 minutes on the substance of Medicare. You'll see that pop up time and time again, and I'm just disappointed no one mentions it. Actually, the thing I'm probably proudest of is Chairman Greenspan and the Federal Reserve had been trying to keep inflation down. Since Galbraith, we've really talked about macroeconomics, and we've talked about the Federal Reserve and its ability to control monetary process. If you want to expand the money process, you make money cheap. If you want to contract it, you make it expensive. Why? Because the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve can meet, and on a quarterly basis, even on a monthly basis, they can make adjustments to the discount rate, and we have monetary policy that controls the economic system. We have another device called fiscal policy, in which Congress can make decisions about tax law. But no one thought of fiscal policy because, one, Congress reacts, they don't act. Two, it takes them way longer than it should. And three, they always get it wrong. They overshoot or undershoot. So it isn't an instrument that can be used in a fine-tuned way. So fiscal policy simply became something that was shoved in the attic, and no one thought about it. The problem was, when we came in 2001, the recession that had begun in the last few months of the Clinton administration, after a long expansion policy, began to manifest itself. But the Federal Reserve began trying to control the money supply with a quarter cut. We've seen that recently with the new Fed. And I got to the point after 9 times that I called it one potato, two potato. If you do that every time and you anticipate the Board of Governors meeting the next time and it will be a 1/4 cut, the market anticipates what's going to happen. It discounts it and it doesn't have the desired effect. The other problem is if you take your quarter bite and you do it for several years, you don't have many quarter bites left. They were down to like 1%. What do you do when you get to 0? And they were very close to that. So what we did from the time we were sworn in January to April was to move a major tax bill which cut individual income taxes. And by August, checks were being sent to individuals to be able to spend in the window of back to school, which stimulated the economy. And eventually somebody might notice that fiscal policy came to the rescue of monetary policy at a time when the economy was simply going into the doldrums, when the Federal Reserve had nothing left in the cupboard, and that our policy was pretty much right on and timely. And that we did it in a structure of Congress responding in a fiscal policy way. You haven't seen it historically. That's one time it's happened. It may have been pure luck. I like to think maybe there was a little forethought and a little planning which made it happen. But without that cut, without the money available in the fall to bring the economy back, we would have been in a very difficult time, not just in my opinion, but in Chairman Greenspan's opinion as well. And he said he never thought, you know how they are, he never thought he would have to have fiscal policy rescue him. It was kind of fun.